Okay, welcome back to the Agile Accountant for the second session with Catrin Evans, talking about Excel and modeling and how they're different things, complementary things. In the previous session, Catrin, you were talking about how Excel is the kind of the toolkit, but there's a bigger picture to modeling. So what Excel skills can help us become effective modelers, and maybe what more than Excel do we need to be good modelers?
So I think first of all, it's thinking about formulas within Excel, and it's about having a good toolkit of formulae. And
Mm-hmm.
over the years, I've had a training spreadsheet I've had with about 30
Oh,
formula on it.
okay, interesting.
And for me, it's a case of knowing what is available. It isn't about using it all.
Yes.
It's about keeping it as simple as you can for what it needs to do. Doesn't mean to say it's
Yes.
going to be simple,
No.
but I've seen people cram very complicated formulas, trying to use every weird, wacky formula they can find. My rule of thumb when I'm building a model is build it as if somebody else is going to use it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
A lot of people build it and say, oh, I didn't think about other people using it.
Yeah.
So for me, that's the fundamental principle I always apply is I am building this for other people to use. It means they need a level of Excel knowledge, but once it's built, as long as they have a grasp of what the formulas are, they don't need to know them inside out. But it
Yes.
needs to be set up in a way that other people can follow it. So I always build top to bottom, left to right across a sheet.
Mm-hmm.
If we write a report or a book, we don't start in the middle and then jump to the beginning, to the end, and back again. So actually structuring your spreadsheets, this reduces the risk of error. Making input cells, I always use yellow as the color for an input cell. So you
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
don't change any cell that isn't yellow. And I will if a formula changes across a row now. Actually, I try as much as possible to make sure formulae are consistent across a whole row. But if it is different, I use bright pink because it really stands out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a warning to say, be aware this formula is different to the one next to it. Do not copy this across the row.
Yeah.
But the thing you need with all of this is to have a key at the beginning of the model to say, what do the colours mean? So it's
Yes.
simple little things, but very effective. And as long as people are trained in how to use the model, then all of this stuff adds to that formulaic knowledge. But it's I've seen people often with complicated formulas because they don't know a simple formula such as EO month, which stands for end of month.
Yeah. Yeah.
That allows you to take a date and run any number of months from the to the end of that month. It saves an awful lot of analysis. So if you take, say you've got invoices in a month and you want to add up the amount invoiced every month, people say, well, all the dates are different within the month, so how on earth do I add these up? Well, if you convert every date to an end of month date, then you can add up the 31st of January, the 28th of February. And so you can then very easily add up your monthly invoices because you've done one extra step, which is invoice date, end of month in which it was invoiced. Now sum up your end of month invoice dates.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah.
So it's taking that formulaic knowledge and thinking how you can apply it.
Yeah.
What is the formula that gives you that bit of flexibility or that agility to say, I know what I want to do. I can't do it with the data I've got, but is there one or two extra formulas I can use to convert that data to what I need to easily add something up?
I don't want you to tell me your whole list of 30 formulae, but what would be some of the highlights? And we've already mentioned XLOOKUP, which is one of my highlight formulae. What are the key formulae that you like to use in a model?
Um, that's a really interesting question. I think for me, sum ifs is a
Yeah.
fairly obvious one. XLOOKUP is another, but there are some interesting ones like trim, which takes
Oh,
away
yeah.
leading and trailing spaces if you've got grotty data out of a system.
Yeah.
Left and right can be very useful.
Yeah.
If you know there's some consistent bit of information on the first three fields and that gives you something you can then sum up on. As I say, year month is one I've always found very powerful. So there's lots of different ones, and they're not, sometimes these are data analysis skills, but you can use them powerfully either for data analysis or in a model, and those two things are very different for me. Data analysis can be a one-off, how do I clean up a set of data?
Yes.
And that's where pivot tables come in very useful. But I had a reputation for years as hating pivot tables. I didn't hate pivot tables. I hated pivot tables in models because they change shape and size and layout. And if you've got something linked into it,
you can't.
Your model's then broken, and you can turn off get pivot table data or turn it on. But they can be dangerous in a model, but they're great for data analysis. So it's about where you use what part of the Excel toolkit.
Yeah. And moving beyond Excel, what other skills should anyone watching want to, develop their skills into more modeling? What broader skills than just knowing how to use XLOOKUP?
That's a really, really good question. And for me, it's very much around, I'd call it almost interrogation skills, but that's not quite the right term for it. It's basically having the ability to think strategically and to analyze, but also to be able to scrabble under the surface and ask the right questions. You get some people who are modelers who are brilliant at the spreadsheet side of stuff, but they will just build what you tell them you want built.
Yes, indeed.
They won't challenge, they won't ask, they won't question. And for me, I would rather have somebody whose Excel skills are slightly less absolutely knows every formula under the sun, but has that ability to ask the right question. Because if, I've had people say to me, oh, we want to develop a report and it needs to replicate this, but we just want it built in a better way in Excel. And the first thing I ask them is it the right report? Because actually very often what they're building is not the information they need to be looking at. So it's trying to get under the skin of the business. I've calculated a number of onerous contract provisions, and it's always started with, oh, we need a model built. But actually what they need is somebody who can come in and help them ask the right questions. Why are the finances struggling? It's usually not the finances that are struggling, well, they are, but the problem is in the operations.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. The finances are just kind of lagging indicators.
Yes.
It's the activity behind them that drives the numbers. Yeah.
So somebody who can get the head out of the finance and out of the spreadsheet, and actually, I'm not saying you need to be an expert in the operations, that's not your job, but you need to be able to understand business and talk to business people in a language they understand. So and this again comes back to what we talked in the first session. Why is Excel good rather than a system? A lot of people who build systems are IT focused, they're not business focused.
Yes, very good point. So people skills just as important, perhaps even more important than good Excel skills for modeling?
I think so, personally, which is almost the opposite of what people view as a good modeler, somebody who sits in the corner tapping away on their keyboard and spreadsheet. For me, the best modelers I've come across are those who have excellent communication skills, stakeholder skills. Sometimes you have to give some quite difficult messages, and you have to, you might have to tell people they don't understand their business very well. And that takes a bit of tact and diplomacy sometimes. But you can use the spreadsheet as well, this seems to be what the model's telling me. Are we sure this is right? And so it's teasing that information out or feeding it back, and really understanding what it is people need to use to run their business, and making sure you've got the right outputs in the model.
Yeah.
I've said to many,
go ahead, sorry.
Many an analyst who they've done lots of work and they put up tons of detail on the screen when they're presenting it, but it's not in a way that somebody who is a big picture thinker can understand, because they've thrown all the detail off. You've got to sell the good work by having the right outputs and the right message.
Yes, yes, yes.
I think I've mentioned to you before, when I first moved out of practice into industry, I worked for a chap who taught me a lot. And one of the most powerful things he did for me, I'd sent him a table of numbers out of the model I'd built. And he came back and his reply was brilliant. Really pretty table of numbers, looks great. Could you now tell me what they mean, please?
Yes, yes. Yes, and that's the most important message from the model. What does
Yes,
this mean? If I
yes,
do this, what will happen? If this doesn't happen, what will happen?
exactly. And so, you could build a perfect model, but if you can't help me interpret the outputs and give me the analysis from it, then actually that model's not very useful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's been able to ask, the awkward questions or maybe the slightly stupid questions. You've told me this, but does this ever happen? Or,
Yes.
what if
Yeah.
this comes in at a different time, because you've hard coded it, potentially you've got no,
Yeah.
which leads me nicely to a question. So how does Agile come into all of this? We're talking about being an Agile accountant.
Yeah.
How does the Agile thinking come into modeling?
So for me, modeling is really the ultimate agile way of working to a certain extent, because you are there looking at how do things work. You can break it down into bite-sized pieces. You can do pilots. You can do prototypes. You can get under the skin of the business. You might be asked to build a full forecasting model, but actually you can break that down into, okay, we need to understand historics. How are we going to do that? Let's understand that. How are we going to put actuals into the model so that we can run that into the forecast to understand trends? And that's not always an easy thing to do, but you can break that down into a separate item. You can take all your different calculations, you can do your staff cost calculations, put that together, interrogate it, ask, is this the right way of doing it? Get that bit right, deliver that bit. So that might mean, okay, you haven't built the full forecast model, but they've got a better understanding of their staff costs quickly.
Yeah.
And transparency. I think you just mentioned hard code. That's another of my bugbears. Never hard code a number into a model.
Hmm.
I think the best example on that for me was VAT rates. It was 17.5% for most of my
Yeah,
life
yeah.
until it changed to 20%, and so many models had hard coded 17.5% in formulae. So even if you think it's never going to change, I always put the number of days in a year, 365, in an input cell. Now, I don't think that one's going to change, but it just means that it is labeled so people can clearly see what that
Yeah,
365 relates to. If it's in a formula, I might assume that's the number of days in the year, but it could be something else.
could be something else. Yeah.
So for me, transparency in a well-built model where every input is labelled clearly with consistent labelling, we know what those inputs mean, that drives us forward into really being able to understand what's in the model. So it's that transparency, clarity, clear thinking, all of these things for me. When I was reading Alistair's book around the agile concepts, I read it and said, "Oh, that's how I've always built models. I've done it in stages. I've made it easy to understand. I've kept it simple." People will look at my models and say they're not simple. They're as simple as they can be for what I've been asked to build them to do.
Yes,
And
yes.
that's another skill of a modeler, is to say, hang on a minute, we're trying to do too much in this model. We
Oh, good
can't make
point.
it a bid model. We can't and a forecasting model and an actuals updating model and. Let's take a step back. Do we need separate models? You can build a bid model to flow through into an operating model, but it's very difficult.
Yes, yes.
And so much in the world of bidding is very theoretical. The aim of bidding is to say, what is the price we're going to win this at? Once you get into the operation of the contract, you know the price. What you're then trying to do is manage your costs and your delivery and your revenue streams. So
Yeah.
they're actually two different purposes.
Hmm.
You're best off, in my mind, usually keeping those two things separate. You still need the bid model to refer to, but you're trying to do two separate things.
Yes.
So for me, that sort of ties into the agile world of trying to understand what it is you're doing and keeping it consistent, but agile, and thinking about what it is you were trying to achieve rather than trying to do everything in one bucket. Break
Yeah.
it down into achievable parts.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful point. I can remember times when, you're asked to do a kind of forecast model of the future, but it's also attached to a cash flow, and it also gives you the balance sheet and profit and loss account. And, it's too much.
Yeah.
It's just it's doable with lots and lots and lots of effort, but it doesn't really help you.
No, and if you're trying to do too much, you end up doing nothing well. So trying
Yes,
to do
exactly.
things well.
Yeah.
You mentioned financial statements. One of the other key things for me within a model is to have a well-built, integrated set of financial statements.
Hmm.
And I've always done these using something called control accounts, which are effectively a modeling version of T accounts, but all
Hmm.
my data flows through the T accounts and into the financial statements so that I know the balance sheet will always balance.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
It doesn't mean the numbers are right. But I'm not sitting there with somebody
Yeah.
saying to me, my balance sheet doesn't balance, and I'm then trying to unpick their double entry, which is totally unfathomable.
Yeah.
And one of my first roles in Big Four modelling, we often did model reviews, and the balance sheet would rarely balance when they came in. And trying to unpick that was always a nightmare. So building your financial statements in a way that you can see what the double entries are is a must.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Let's just finish this session on revisiting one point that you said, which I think is pretty important, and that's about you mentioned the 365 days, having a tab at the front with all your inputs and your assumptions in the VAT rate, the interest rate that you're going to be paying on the loan to pay for this project. You
Absolutely.
mentioned yellow cells, but keep it completely separate
Yes.
from the model.
Yes. That way people know where to go to find the
Exactly.
inputs.
Yeah.
I often say to people, there's no point you putting an input cell on row 2000 of your
Yes.
calculation sheet. I
Absolutely.
am not going to know it's there.
Yes.
If I've got an input sheet, or at least know that the input section is at the top of every page, I know where to go to review all those inputs and to understand them, and to make sure I've only put them in once, because you don't want VAT at 20% in one place and 17.5% somewhere
Yeah.
else.
Yes.
Also allows you to manage scenario
Exactly.
analysis.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I've often done it in a way where you might have in 10 columns, and you can use a choose function to say which of these set of inputs
Yeah.
am I using to
I'm not
run the
going to use.
model.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But absolutely, inputs must be separated and clearly labeled as inputs by using yellow is usually used. The Southern Hemisphere often uses blue, so you can get interesting conversations where people debate that. But as long as you're clear about what the colour is for inputs, you've got
Yeah.
a key at the beginning of the model. It can be any colour, but just be
Yeah.
consistent about its
Yeah.
use.
Yeah. I once had to take over somebody else's cash flow sheet forecast. It was a massive spreadsheet. There was no input tab. Inputs were all
Yeah,
over the place. There were different bits and different parts of this huge sheet. I
yeah,
just couldn't get to grips with it. I had to start completely again and work the entire weekend,
yeah.
to get a cash flow for this company.
I can imagine. And I think for me, what are the two important parts that other people need to be able to find in a model? It's the outputs and the inputs,
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
because that is what the senior management or whoever you're working for will want to review. They want to review the outputs, but to understand the outputs, they need to understand the inputs.
Yeah.
As long as we've agreed the calculations are what they need to be, they don't need to be looking at the calculations. But
Yeah.
once the model's up and running, inputs will change by their nature.
Yeah.
So they need to be easily reviewable as much as the outputs.
I entirely agree. And let's come back in our next session and talk a bit more about scenario planning aspect of this as well. But we'll finish there for just now. So thank you very much, Catrin, and we shall catch up in the next session.
Excellent. Thanks, Ross.
Good.